So I am talking to
Dahlby K. Keith Dahlby.
Keith Dahlby. And why don't you give a little bit of an introduction to yourself?
All right. Well, yeah. So I've been coming to the Twin Cities Code Camp for many years now. I live down in Cedar Rapids, Iowa. I sell motorcycle parts for a living. Yeah, good times.
And so you're doing talks on Git. We're done, right?
Not this time, surprisingly.
I know, surprisingly. So you are doing two talks,
I'm doing two talks.
The first one is a developer talk, but not very code driven in a sense. It's the expert beginner talk, and then you're doing in the afternoon a talk on Owen. So let's talk about the first talk.
Let's talk about the first talk.
So are you behind the Twitter account?
I am not behind the Twitter account. I can't take credit. I believe that Eric Dietrich is behind his own.
I don't believe
behind his own Twitter account.
In case for people wondering, it's
so,
called Expert. Is it Expert Beginner?
Expert Beginner 1.
Okay.
So Expert Beginner is a series of blog posts written by a guy called Eric Dietrich out of Chicago that essentially describes kind of a type of developer who's stopped learning. And so, essentially, as you're progressing through your career, you can either realize there's a whole bunch of stuff that you don't know, in which case you go out of your way to expose yourself to those things, like coming to the code camp. Mm-hmm. Or there's kind of a fork in the road where you can just decide, I know enough. I'm going to stop learning new things and just get really good at what I know. And so Eric has coined this as the expert beginner, someone who is very, very practiced at being a beginner.
Okay.
And so, it produces a whole variety of unhealthy behaviors.
And that's kind of what you're talking about, because you had a run-in, so to speak, in your career with this.
I had a run-in with a vice president expert beginner. My development team was attached to his organization, and we talked through all of our differences: Git versus TFS, MVC versus web forms, VB versus C#, testing versus not, continuous integration versus not. All of the things that we as an industry know are things that we should be doing or moving toward.
And you were on the TFS, web forms, VB side, right?
Absolutely.
Okay.
The more web forms in my life, the better. And I went to bat for all these things, thinking, there's no reasonable way that this argument could end with us deciding that web forms is a better choice for a public-facing website. That's just not something that really ever occurred to me. And I went to bat on all of these bullet points, and I lost. Because this was just someone who was very convinced that he knew enough, and there wasn't really anything that I could teach him. I mean, he comes to me and says, I installed Git, and I don't think it provides any value. Now, not to toot my own horn, but I speak about Git a lot. I know Git better than most people. And so for him to say, I installed it, therefore I know enough to have this conversation with you is just kind of disconcerting, shall we say. So ultimately, I left the organization. And so
But you're back there now.
So I'm back there now, and so the talk is basically about kind of that saga.
And you're back there now because said person is no longer
with the organization.
Okay. And so the talk is just essentially experiencing that, what you learned from it, and hopefully how to maybe avoid it, or if you do get in that situation, what are some things to make it?
So there are two points. One is watch out for this in your own development. If you get to the point where you're arguing with things, that's just not the way we do things.
Yeah.
You're in a bad spot. You always want to be looking. Assume that other people know more than you, and try to learn from them. And it may be that you're in a better spot than they are, but not always.
Right.
I felt like I was probably in a better spot than the other guy, but I was curious what I had to learn from him, and that was not reciprocated. But then two is. Essentially, what is our plan if we're dealing with the organizational fallout of having this sort of an influence across the entire development organization. Okay. So those are really the two elements of the talk that we try to speak to.
All right. And the other talk, now, do you have a ring that actually has written one delegate to rule them all?
No, I regret that the metal workers were not able to complete it in time for today's.
That would be kind of cool to have that written on there. I think it would be cool.
I think it would be cool as well.
I think you should do that.
Probably not.
But in any event, so you're doing the one delegate to rule them all talk on Owen. So
yes.
What is Owen?
So Owen is the open web interface for .NET. Several years ago, a collection of holdouts from the alt.NET days started to realize that, just like most platforms, in Python they've got WSGI, and in Ruby they've got Rack. In a lot of platforms, they have essentially a standard abstraction between hosts for web applications, whether it's Apache or Nginx or whatever, and then kind of the front end applications. And so they set out to define this sort of interface for .NET, and it went through several iterations, some very heavy interfaces, base classes, all that sort of stuff, and ultimately they arrived at a delegate that just takes in a dictionary of the environment. So things like the requested URL and HTTP headers, all that sort of stuff, and you produce an action which says, I promise to give you something later, and then what I give you later kind of defines defines the result of the request.
So highly scalable web applications require one function.
No.
They boil down to one function, yes.
Okay.
Yes.
And then you can put all your enterprise overhead inside of that.
Yes, and so really Owen is just kind of a common language for components to speak. So rather than sort of the system.web behemoth, where you have caching and security and authorization, authentication, all of those things built in, instead you say, all right, well, let me pull in an authentication piece that only speaks Google and Microsoft flyby.
Yeah.
But I don't care about Windows auth because I'm not building a Windows application. And hey, I want a caching layer, and so I don't like any of the existing options, so I'm just going to write one piece that knows about how we approach caching, and I'll just stick that into the pipeline. I'll stick that after authorization, but before the primary application. Okay. And so you end up with this kind of composable pipeline of these components, rather than this is the one way that a request lifetime can proceed through the existing system.web stack.
Is this underlying all the ASP.NET VNext stuff that's coming up?
It's related. So the ASP.NET stuff fundamentally does build on Owen. They also have kind of a next layer up that they tend to depend on. I think one of the interesting questions for the community is, are people going to bet on ASP.NET VNext's abstraction as the way that they should work, or do they target the next level down, which is compatible with anything Microsoft is doing, but also then compatible with anything that hasn't embraced the Microsoft approach? What I really like about Owen is that it is so very simple. It is literally just a function that takes in a dictionary and eventually returns. And so because of that, building components that target that model is very kind of safe.
Yeah.
I build this component and then anybody can depend on it. Microsoft in the past has missed the mark on abstractions for web stuff. I'm very confident in what they're doing now with VNext. But if they overlook something, oh hey, it turns out it's not compatible with WebSockets.
Yeah.
Which is the case today. Right now, the whole of the web stack isn't really all that happy with WebSockets. And so, if they miss the mark there, how does the VNext abstraction deal with it as opposed to Owen? We can just define, all right, this is the standard way to deal with WebSockets, and then hopefully anyone dealing in that space will embrace it accordingly.
Well, thanks, Keith. Appreciate it.
Thanks for having me.